The day our father was buried, my younger brother Marcus stood at the graveside in a brand new suit and smiled at people who came to offer their condolences. My brother Dean and I stood a few feet away and said nothing. We already knew what Marcus had done. We just weren't ready to show it yet. Stick with me while I share my story. If it touches you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. My name is Nora Calloway, and this is the story of how my brother Dean and I lost everything we were supposed to inherit and spent the next several years making sure the truth couldn't stay buried. Dean is 2 years older than me. Growing up, people always said we looked alike, same dark eyes, same way of going quiet when something bothered us. That silence was something we learned early, because in our house, speaking up rarely changed anything. Our father, Gerald Calloway, was a decent man who worked hard and built a modest but real estate portfolio over 30 years, a family home in Colorado, 2 rental properties, and a piece of land outside Denver that had quietly tripled in value. He always said the properties would stay in the family. He said it so many times that we stopped thinking it needed to be written down. That was our first mistake. Dean requested a copy of the original will through Garrett's office the following week. Garrett was cooperative in the way that attorneys are when they believe everything is already settled, polite, unhurried, slightly patronizing. The copy arrived by mail 9 days later. Dean drove to my apartment the same evening it showed up at his address, and we spread both documents on my kitchen table, the copy from Garrett and our father's handwritten letter, and compared them side by side. The will was notarized by a man named Robert Pell, licensed in Colorado, with a witness signature below his. Everything looked official. The date was correct. The formatting was standard. But 2 things caught Dean's attention immediately. The first was the signature itself. Gerald Calloway had signed his name the same way his entire life, a hard capital G that leaned slightly forward, the last letters trailing off in a specific pattern that we had both seen on birthday cards, on checks, on the back of photographs. The signature on the will had the right letters, but the lean was different. Subtle enough that most people would not notice. Not subtle enough for 2 people who had been reading their father's handwriting since childhood. The second thing was the date. Gerald signed the will on a Thursday. Dean pulled up the medical records we had been given as next of kin and cross-referenced the hospital notes from that week. On that Thursday, our father had been administered a sedative adjustment that his attending physician had flagged as causing significant cognitive impairment for a window of 36 to 48 hours. The note was brief and clinical, but the implication was not. Our father had allegedly signed a legal document transferring his entire estate during a period when his own doctors had recorded that he was not fully alert. Dean set the medical record down and looked at me. Neither of us said the obvious thing out loud because saying it out loud made it real in a way we were not ready for yet. Instead, Dean said he needed more before we could do anything with what we had. A handwriting inconsistency and a medical flag were starting points, not conclusions. If we moved too soon or too loudly, Marcus would have time to prepare. We needed everything locked down before anyone knew we were looking. I had 1 semester left in my graduate program in law. I accelerated. I finished my coursework in the spring and passed the bar that summer. Dean, who had been managing a construction project business for 6 years by then, kept working and quietly set aside money every month into an account we had opened together. We did not talk about the plan at family gatherings. We did not mention the letter. We showed up to Diane's birthday dinner and Christmas and said nothing about any of it. Marcus bought a new truck 3 months after the will was read and started renovating the family home. We watched and stayed quiet. What Marcus never understood about Dean and me was that our patience was not passivity. It never had been. Every year of being overlooked in that house had trained us to wait without appearing to wait, to prepare without announcing it. Marcus had grown up watching doors open for him and assumed that was simply how doors worked. He had no frame of reference for what it looked like when 2 people decided to build their own. By the time I passed the bar, we had the letter, the signature comparison, the medical records, and the name of a forensic document examiner based in Denver who had testified in 3 probate fraud cases in the previous 5 years. Dean had already made the call. The appointment was set for the following month. We were no longer grieving. We were working. The forensic examiner's name was Carol Whitman. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Denver that looked like it had been built in the 80s and never fully updated. She was a small woman in her late 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the manner of someone who had spent decades being the most precise person in every room she entered. Dean and I sat across from her with copies of the will, 3 samples of our father's authentic signature pulled from old tax documents and property deeds, and the handwritten letter from the box. She spent 40 minutes examining everything without saying much. Then she put down her magnifier and told us what she saw. The signature on the will showed inconsistencies in pen pressure, letter spacing, and the terminal stroke of the final letter that were not present in any of the authenticated samples. She could not say in that room that the signature was forged, because that conclusion required a full written analysis, and she would not put her name on anything she had not fully documented. But she told us clearly that what she was looking at warranted serious examination, and that she had seen enough contested signatures in her career to recognize when something was wrong. She completed her full report 3 weeks later. 14 pages. The conclusion was measured and precise in the way that expert reports have to be, but the core finding was unambiguous. The signature on Gerald Calloway's will presented multiple characteristics inconsistent with the authenticated exemplars and was consistent with simulation by a third party. Dean read the report twice at my kitchen table, then set it down and exhaled slowly. We had the letter. We had the medical records showing cognitive impairment on the date of signing. We now had a forensic document examiner's written conclusion that the signature did not match our father's known handwriting. What we did not yet have was the notary. Robert Pell was still licensed and still practicing in Colorado Springs. I spent 2 weeks researching him before we made any contact. His record was clean on the surface, no complaints filed, no disciplinary actions. But Dean found something through a property search that Pell had purchased a second property 18 months after notarizing Gerald's will. The purchase price was just under a reporting threshold. It was not proof of anything on its own. But it was the kind of detail that sits differently once you already have everything else. I called Pell's office and made an appointment under a name he would not recognize. Dean drove me there and waited in the parking lot. The meeting was scheduled for 30 minutes. I was inside for 22. I sat down across from Pell and introduced myself by my real name. I watched his expression shift the moment he made the connection. I told him calmly that I was a licensed attorney, that I represented the interests of the Calloway estate, and that I had in my possession a forensic analysis of the will he had notarized along with medical documentation establishing that the signatory was cognitively impaired at the time of signing. I told him that notarizing a document under those conditions, particularly one where the signature itself showed evidence of inconsistency, carried significant professional and criminal exposure. I did not raise my voice. I did not make threats. I simply laid out what we had and told him that how things proceeded from that point depended largely on what he chose to do next. Pell was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if he could have a few days. I told him he had until the end of the week. He called Dean's number, which I had left on a card 48 hours later. He said he wanted to talk. Dean arranged for us to meet at my office with a recorder running and a written disclosure agreement already prepared. Pell arrived alone, sat down, and within 20 minutes had told us everything. Marcus had approached him 4 months before Gerald died. He had paid Pell in 2 installments, the second coming after the document was filed. Pell had been present at the signing, but Gerald had been nearly unresponsive. The signature on the document was not Gerald's. Pell had signed as witness and notary knowing that. He signed the disclosure. He agreed to cooperate fully in any legal proceeding. He left the office looking like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. Dean and I sat in my office after he left and did not say anything for a while. We had everything now. The letter, the medical records, the forensic report, a signed confession from the notary who had executed the fraud. Marcus had taken the family home, the rental properties, and the land outside Denver. He had done it while our father was dying and while Dean and I stood at that graveside saying nothing because we thought grief was the only thing happening around us. Now it was time to sit down. I called Marcus on a Tuesday afternoon and told him I wanted to arrange a family meeting to discuss some unresolved matters related to our father's estate. I kept my voice neutral and my words vague because I needed him in a room, not on his guard. Marcus asked what kind of unresolved matters. I told him there were some documents that needed to be reviewed before everything could be formally closed. He said he would check his schedule. I told him the meeting would include Dean, our mother, and a legal representative. He paused for a moment, then said that was fine. He did not ask which legal representative. That told me everything about how confident he still was. The meeting was set for a Friday morning at my office. Dean arrived an hour early, and we went through everything one final time: the letter, the medical records, Whitman's forensic report, Pell's signed disclosure, and the 2 property deeds that Marcus had already transferred into his name. We arranged them in a specific order because the order mattered. You do not open with your strongest evidence. You build toward it so that by the time it lands, there is no more room for the other person to move. Diane arrived first. She looked tired and a little confused about why she had been asked to come. I poured her coffee and told her we just needed everyone present. She sat down at the small conference table and looked around the room the way she always did in unfamiliar situations, searching for the version of events that would be the least upsetting to hold on to. Marcus came in 7 minutes late. He was dressed casually, which I noticed because it meant he had not taken the meeting seriously enough to prepare for it. He shook Dean's hand and nodded at me and sat down at the table with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the ground under him was solid. I opened by telling him that in the course of settling our father's affairs, Dean and I had come across some material that raised questions about the document filed with Garrett's office. I slid a copy of Gerald's handwritten letter across the table. Marcus looked at it. His expression did not change immediately. He was better at controlling his face than I had expected, but his jaw tightened in a way that was visible if you were watching for it, and I had been watching for it for 2 years. He said he had never seen that letter before. I told him the date on the letter and the date on the will were 6 weeks apart, and that in the letter their father had described his intentions in detail that contradicted the document on file. Marcus said people change their minds, especially near the end of their lives. His voice was still even. Diane looked between us without speaking. I slid the medical records across next. I walked him through the attending physician's notes from the Thursday the will was signed, the sedative adjustment, the documented impairment window, the flag in the chart. Marcus said that Gerald had good days and bad days, and that a single chart note did not mean he was incapable of signing a document. His answer came slightly faster than his first one. Then I placed Carol Whitman's forensic report on the table. I gave him a moment to look at the cover page and read her credentials before I summarized the finding. 14 pages of analysis concluding that the signature on the will was inconsistent with every authenticated sample of Gerald Calloway's handwriting in our possession and consistent with simulation by a third party. Marcus picked up the report and held it. His hands were steady, but he had stopped making eye contact with me. Diane said quietly that she did not understand what simulation by a third party meant. Dean explained it to her in plain language. The room went very still after he finished. Marcus set the report down and said that one examiner's opinion was not a legal conclusion. He said the will had been properly notarized and filed, and that we were welcome to challenge it in court if we believed we had grounds. His voice had the texture of someone working hard to sound unimpressed. I let that sit for a moment. Then I slid the last document across the table. Robert Pell's signed disclosure. 4 pages. Marcus's name appeared in it 11 times. He read the first page. Then he stopped reading and put it face down on the table. He looked at the window for a moment instead of at any of us. Diane reached out and turned the disclosure over and began reading it herself. About halfway through the first page, she set it down and looked at Marcus without saying anything. That look lasted a long time. Marcus asked if he could have some water. Dean got up and poured him a glass from the pitcher on the credenza. Marcus drank half of it and set the glass down carefully, like he was trying to buy himself time with small, precise movements. Then he asked what we wanted. Part 7. Dean answered the question. He had prepared a 1-page document that outlined exactly what we were asking for: a full transfer of the family home, both rental properties, and the land outside Denver back into the estate, to be redistributed according to the terms our father had described in his letter. Marcus would receive the portion Gerald had originally intended for him, contingent on the same conditions our father had written down. Nothing punitive. Nothing beyond what Gerald had actually wanted. Dean slid the document across the table and told Marcus he had 2 weeks to review it with his own attorney before we expected a response. He said that if Marcus chose not to cooperate, the next conversation would not happen in this office. It would happen in a courtroom, and everything on that table would become part of the public record. Marcus picked up the document and read it slowly. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside. Diane had not spoken since she finished reading Pell's disclosure. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the table in front of her rather than at any of her children. When Marcus finished reading, he set the paper down and said he needed time to think. Dean told him that was what the 2 weeks were for. Marcus looked at me once before he stood up, a long look that I did not try to interpret, and then he left without saying anything else to either of us. We heard the door to the hallway close behind him. Diane stayed seated. After a moment, she asked me in a very quiet voice whether any of this could have been handled differently. I told her honestly that it could have been handled earlier if we had known sooner what we were dealing with. She nodded slowly and did not ask anything else. Before she left, she stopped in the doorway and said she was sorry. She said it looking at the wall rather than at either of us, which told me she was still not entirely sure who she was saying it to. Dean thanked her for coming. I walked her to the elevator. When I came back, Dean was standing at the window looking out at the street below. Neither of us felt the need to say much. We had spent 2 years building toward that room, and now the room was done, and what came next was waiting, which was the one thing we had always been good at. Marcus contacted us through his own attorney 11 days later. His attorney called mine and indicated that his client was prepared to discuss terms. We met once more, this time with both legal representatives present, in a conference room at a neutral office downtown. Marcus came in looking like he had not been sleeping well. His attorney did most of the talking, as attorneys do, but the decisions belonged to Marcus and everyone in the room knew it. The negotiation took most of the afternoon. Marcus pushed back on 2 of the conditions our father had written into his portion, not the properties themselves, just the conditions attached to a share. We held on one and gave ground on the other, because Dean had told me before we walked in that we were not there to punish Marcus. We were there to finish what our father had started. There is a difference between justice and punishment, and Dean had always understood it more cleanly than I did. By 4 in the afternoon, Marcus signed. The transfer documents were filed the following week. The land outside Denver, the 2 rental properties, and the family home were returned to the estate and redistributed according to Gerald Calloway's original intentions. Robert Pell's disclosure had already been forwarded to the Colorado Secretary of State's Notary Division. Whatever happened to his license after that was no longer our concern. We had not filed criminal charges against Marcus. Dean had made that decision early, and I had agreed with it, not because what Marcus did was small, but because our father's letter had not asked us to destroy his youngest son. It had asked us to protect what he had built. We drove home separately that evening. Dean called me from the road about an hour after we left downtown. He did not say much. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was tired in a way that felt different from regular tired, like something that had been running in the background for 2 years had finally been switched off. He said he knew exactly what I meant. I believed him. A few months after the transfers were finalized, I drove to the family home on a Saturday morning. Not for any particular reason, I just wanted to see it. The renovation Marcus had started was half finished. New windows on the front, fresh paint on one side of the exterior, the other side, still the original color from 20 years ago. It looked like a house caught between 2 versions of itself. I sat in my car at the curb for a while and thought about our father. Not about the will or the letter or any of the documents we had spent 2 years collecting. Just Gerald, the way he repainted the mailbox every few years, the way he called on Sunday evenings for no reason except to check in, the way he had looked at Dean and me during those last months like he was trying to say something he hadn't figured out how to say yet. He ran out of time before he got there. That was the part that stayed with me longest, not the fraud, not Marcus, not the legal process. Just the fact that our father had tried to do the right thing at the end and almost didn't make it. Dean flew in 2 weeks later, and we walked through the house together. It needed work, but the structure was solid, which our father had always said about things he cared about. We hired a contractor in the spring and finished what Marcus had started. We did it without discussing it much, because it did not require discussion. It was just the next thing. Diane called occasionally. The conversations were careful and a little short, but they happened, which was more than I had expected. She never directly addressed what Marcus had done or what we had uncovered. Some people process things by moving forward rather than looking back, and I had known my mother long enough to recognize that she was one of them. I did not need her to say the right words. I just needed the calls to keep coming, and they did. Marcus moved to another city about 6 months after the settlement. I heard about it through Diane, not from him directly. He had not contacted either of us since the afternoon he signed the documents. I did not expect him to, and I did not spend time thinking about what his life looked like now. That chapter belonged to him. What I thought about instead was the letter. Gerald had written it on plain white paper with a pen that was running low on ink. You could see it in the way some lines were lighter than others. He had sealed it and placed it in a box under a canvas jacket and trusted that one of us would find it. He had not known for certain that we would. He had just done the thing he could do and hoped it was enough. It was enough. Dean and I did not celebrate when the transfers went through. There was no dinner, no moment where we looked at each other and felt triumphant. What we felt was closer to the quiet that comes after a long drive, the engine off, the silence settling in, the sense that you arrive somewhere without quite being able to identify the moment you got there. Our father had spent 30 years building something he wanted to pass down intact. It took us 2 more years, but we finished the job he started. Not because we needed to win. Because he had asked us to protect what he built, and that was the kind of ask that did not come with an expiration date. We had always been the quiet ones. It turned out that was exactly what the job required. Our childhood home sat on a quiet street in Colorado Springs where most families knew each other by name. From the outside, the Calloway house looked like any other, a well-kept yard, a porch with 2 chairs, a mailbox that my father repainted every few years because he said small things told people who you were. Inside, the rules were clear even though nobody ever said them out loud. Marcus came first. Dean and I understood that before we were old enough to put words to it. Marcus was 6 years younger than me, which meant that by the time he was old enough to notice how the house worked, Dean and I had already figured out our place in it. Our mother, Diane, was a warm woman in most ways, but she had a blind spot the size of a highway when it came to her youngest. Marcus could do something careless, and she would find a reason it made sense. Dean could do the same thing, and she would sit him down for a 20-minute conversation about responsibility. I stopped keeping score somewhere around middle school because the numbers never moved in our favor. Our father was different, but not different enough. Gerald Calloway loved all 3 of us, and I believed that then, and I believe it now. But he was also a man who avoided conflict the way some people avoid bad weather. He would rather step around it than stand in it. When Marcus got caught cheating on a school exam, our father handled it quietly and never brought it up again. When Dean lost a part-time job during his junior year because his manager accused him of something he didn't do, our father spent 2 weeks asking Dean what he could have done differently. The situations were not the same, but the standard applied to each son was. I learned to build my own sense of what I was worth because waiting for my parents to reflect it back to me was a losing strategy. Dean did the same thing, just more quietly. He worked after school from the age of 15, saved most of what he earned, and never complained about the fact that Marcus's college fund was set up 3 years before anyone mentioned ours. Dean simply found a way around it. That was his nature, not angry, not bitter, just methodical. He looked at obstacles the way an engineer looks at a problem. There was always another route if you were willing to take the time to find it. Marcus, by contrast, had never needed to find another route because the main road was always cleared for him. He dropped out of his first college after a year and a half, moved back home, and spent the next 2 years telling everyone he was figuring things out. Our parents covered his rent when he eventually got his own apartment. They helped him buy a car after his first one was repossessed. Every time something fell apart for Marcus, the family caught him before he hit the ground. Dean and I watched all of this from a distance and kept moving forward on our own. What I did not fully understand then was how much Gerald had started to see it too. It happened gradually, the way most realizations do, not in one sharp moment, but across a series of small ones. I noticed it first during a Sunday dinner about 2 years before he got sick. Marcus had just asked our father to co-sign a loan for a business idea that had no plan behind it, just enthusiasm and a number. Gerald said he needed to think about it. That was unusual. Normally he said yes before the question was finished. A few weeks later, Marcus mentioned the loan again and Gerald told him no. Marcus acted wounded for the rest of the meal and Diane tried to smooth it over, but our father sat with his decision and did not move. After that dinner, Gerald started calling Dean and me more often. Not for any dramatic reason, just to talk. He asked about Dean's work, about my graduate program, about what we were planning for the next few years. The conversations felt different from the ones we'd had when we were younger. He listened more carefully, asked follow-up questions, and sometimes said things that seemed like they had been sitting in him for a while waiting for the right moment to come out. One evening he told me that he had made mistakes in how he had divided his attention over the years, and that he wanted to do better before he ran out of time to do it. I told him there was plenty of time. He smiled, but did not agree with me. Gerald was diagnosed 8 months later. Lung cancer, caught later than it should have been because he had ignored symptoms for almost a year. The treatment bought him time, but not as much as anyone wanted. During those months, he became more direct about things he had previously left unsaid. He told Dean and me that he had been working on updating his estate documents and that he wanted to make sure the properties were handled properly after he was gone. He used the word properly in a way that felt deliberate, like he was making a point without saying it directly. We did not press him on it because he was tired and we did not want to spend the time we had left talking about paperwork. That was our second mistake. Gerald Calloway died on a Tuesday morning in March. He was 67 years old. The house felt completely different the moment we got the call, like the air pressure had changed overnight. Dean drove 4 hours to get there. I was already in the city and arrived first. Marcus was there when I walked in, and he was already on the phone with someone, speaking in a low voice that stopped the moment he saw me come through the door. I told myself it was grief. People behave strangely when they lose a parent. I told myself that for about 3 weeks, until the day we sat down with the attorney and heard a will read aloud that our father had never described to either of us. The attorney's office was small and smelled like old paper and carpet cleaner. There were 4 of us in the room: Dean, me, Marcus, and our mother Diane. The attorney, a thin man named Philip Garrett, sat behind a desk covered in folders and spoke in the careful, unhurried tone of someone who had delivered bad news many times and had learned to pace it. He explained that Gerald Calloway had updated his will approximately 6 weeks before his death. He said the word updated the way people say it when they want to avoid saying replaced. Dean and I received personal belongings, some furniture, our father's watch collection, a few boxes of photographs. The family home in Colorado Springs, both rental properties, and the land outside Denver were left entirely to Marcus Calloway. The room stayed quiet for a moment after Garrett finished reading. Marcus kept his hands folded on his knees and looked at the desk. He did not look surprised. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man sitting through a formality he had already accounted for. Diane reached over and placed her hand on his arm. Dean sat completely still beside me, and I recognized that stillness because I had seen it my whole life. It was the way he looked when he was deciding not to react until he understood what he was reacting to. I asked Garrett when exactly our father had signed the document. He checked the paperwork and gave me the date. I wrote it down on the inside cover of the folder I had brought with me. I did not ask anything else that day. On the drive home, Dean and I did not talk much. He stared at the road, and I looked out the passenger window at the flat stretch of highway and thought about the last real conversation I had with our father. Gerald had been tired that day, oxygen levels lower than usual, voice thinner than it had been even a week before. He told me he was not worried about the properties because everything was already written down the way he wanted it. He said Dean and I had earned what was coming to us. Those were close to his exact words. I had no reason at the time to wonder what they meant. 3 weeks after the reading, Dean came to visit me for a weekend. We spent most of Saturday going through the boxes our father had left us. Most of it was what you would expect: old receipts, tools, books with cracked spines, a few framed photos that had been taken down from walls and never rehung. Near the bottom of the 3rd box, underneath a folded canvas jacket that still smelled faintly like Gerald's garage, Dean found an envelope. It was sealed and had no name written on the outside, just a small pencil mark in the corner that looked like our father's handwriting. Dean set it on the table and we looked at it for a moment before either of us touched it. Then I opened it. The letter inside was handwritten on 3 pages of plain white paper. Gerald's handwriting was uneven in places, which told us it had been written during a period when his hands were already giving him trouble. But the words were clear. He wrote that he had intended to update his will before the end of the year and that he had spoken with an attorney about transferring the properties equally between Nora and Dean, with a small portion set aside for Marcus contingent on certain conditions. He wrote that he had not trusted Marcus with full ownership because of patterns he had watched for years and could no longer ignore. He wrote that he loved all 3 of his children, but that love and financial responsibility were not the same thing, and he was old enough to finally stop confusing them. He asked us to be patient with our mother because she saw Marcus through a lens that the rest of us did not share and probably never would. The letter was dated 5 weeks before Gerald died. The will that Garrett had read to us in that small office was dated 1 week after the letter. Dean read the letter twice without saying anything. Then he set it flat on the table and looked at the date for a long time. Our father had written that he planned to update the will. Then, 1 week later, a will appeared that gave everything to Marcus. A will our father had never mentioned to either of us, signed during a period when his oxygen levels were dropping and he was spending most of his time in bed. Dean finally spoke. He said he wanted to see the original document. Not a copy, the original, with the notary stamp and the witness signatures. He said it quietly, the same way he said most things, but there was something underneath the words that I had not heard from him in a long time. It was not anger exactly. It was the sound of a decision being made. I told him I would make some calls. Neither of us slept well that night. But for the first time since we had sat in Garrett's office and heard our father's name read off the top of a document that did not sound like him, I felt something shift. The grief was still there, heavy and real. But underneath it, something else had started, quiet and deliberate, the way everything that mattered between Dean and me had always started. We were not going to let this go.